The air was too still for comfort. Even the soft hum of the orbital platform's environmental regulators sounded cautious, like the machinery itself feared breaking the fragile truce. Jacob Wren sat in the middle of the human diplomatic wing, staring at the wall-mounted clock that didn't seem to move. The white noise from the adjacent infirmary was all that reminded him people were still functioning. Sweat gathered at his temples, despite the regulated 70-degree Fahrenheit temperature. It wasn't the warmth, it was everything else. Outside, through thick, transparent panels, the Velari delegation compound mirrored their own across the open plaza. Sleek, ribbed structures curved like crescent moons cradling their occupants. The Velari were not warm hosts, but they weren't enemies either. Not anymore, not yet. "Vitals still high," a nurse murmured, slipping a monitor off his finger. She looked young, too young to be this calm. "Try to lie back, Mr. Wren." "I'm not the one who got off the shuttle with a spinal bruise," Jacob muttered, glancing toward a nearby cot. Alan Fisk, assistant negotiator, had fallen down the cargo ramp 2 days ago, over-fatigued, underslept, and still trying to manage translation overlays from his hospital bed. His pain meds were wearing off. He looked half dead but still tried to smile. "You're showing signs of mild hypertensive response," the nurse continued. "You need rest." Everyone needed rest. 2 weeks of incremental progress, non-stop discussions, and multi-species arbitration didn't leave room for sleep. Jacob had eaten 3 meals in the past 36 hours, none of them hot. But they were making progress. The Velari Union had agreed to common defense clauses, shared transport corridors, and even trade tariffs. Real milestones, they were winning. That's when the alarms blared. They didn't sound like a drill. The tone was low frequency, insistent, and sickeningly calm. Not blaring like fire alerts, more like the station was trying not to panic anyone while announcing that they were likely going to die. "Vorcral threat detected," the automated voice said. "All personnel initiate lockdown procedure immediately." Jacob's stomach turned to stone. He stood, heartbeat accelerating into raw panic. The nurse froze, then sprinted toward the infirmary's exit. Someone dropped a data slate. Alan groaned from his cot and tried to sit up. Outside, chaos erupted in well-trained silence. Human security guards, 3 on this wing, were already pushing desks and chairs against the doors. One of them held a shock baton in shaking hands. A technician shoved a utility cart across a hallway junction to act as an improvised barricade. Jacob watched it all from the command center, stunned. How in hell did a Vorcral get on this station? "I don't know, sir," barked Lieutenant Choi, one of the guards. Her forehead glistened with sweat. "But it's inbound." Cameras caught it breaching the Western Supply Dome, tore through 3 Velari surveillance drones like they were toys. "They are toys to it," Alan muttered through gritted teeth. "It wiped out 6 settlements on Vescal Minor in under 4 hours. No survivors." Jacob knew that. Everyone did. The Vorcral was nightmare fuel turned flesh. 8 tons of armored sinew and sensory rage. No political enemy would unleash one. This wasn't war. This was something worse. "Close all interior locks." "Don't wait for Central Command," Jacob snapped, voice shaking but firm. Choi nodded and began the override. The doors hissed shut with brutal finality. A red glow bathed the compound emergency status. Alan struggled to sit. "We don't have weapons that can stop it, Jacob." "I know." Someone started crying. Soft, stifled sobs behind a desk. Jacob didn't blame them. They weren't soldiers. They were translators, logistic officers, field medics. The kind of people who helped build things. They weren't supposed to die like this. From the external monitors, a distant camera caught the first visual. Grainy, flickering, a mass of movement that didn't move like anything else. It wasn't sleek, it was relentless. Raw muscle with armor that looked like cracked volcanic rock. Multiple limbs, each ending in bone hooks that punched into steel plating as easily as paper. It tore through a Velari checkpoint without slowing. It was coming for them. In the Velari wing, observers watched in paralyzed disbelief. High Diplomat Ralazana, a bioluminescent being shaped like a willowy crustacean, whispered to her aide, "Has it ever paused before?" "No, Honored One," the aide answered. "It should already be inside." Ralzina lowered her body close to the floor, the Villari gesture of grief. We will never be forgiven for this. Not by them. Not by our own. On the monitors, the Vorcral had reached the entry platform to the humans' compound. And stopped. Jacob heard it before he saw it. The heavy, repeated thuds of something massive pacing on reinforced polymer. Then, silence. An eerie, bone-deep silence. Everyone held their breath. External camera feeds still worked. The Vorcral was at the door. Its massive frame blocked the view. Its chest heaved like a furnace. It scraped one limb against the wall, gouging a 4-foot scar into the exterior. Then, it backed away. One step, then another. The thing turned, twitching its head in tight, erratic jerks, like it couldn't make sense of something. It gave the compound one final look, and then retreated. It retreated. The moment stretched beyond logic. What? Alan asked, voice dry. Is this some kind of animal behavior study? Jacob leaned closer to the screen. His legs trembled. No, that's fear. An hour later, the emergency teams arrived, both human and Valerie medics, flooding the compound with scanners, stretchers, and trauma kits. There were no casualties. But that didn't mean no one was hurt. 3 human staff had sprained limbs from scrambling over overturned furniture. One translator had a panic-induced asthma attack. Alan was diagnosed with acute nerve inflammation from his fall, exacerbated by adrenaline surge. Jacob's blood pressure had spiked into dangerous territory and took hours to stabilize with medication and enforced bed rest. No one slept for the next 16 hours. The Villari medics were baffled. They kept running surface scans of the entry wall, trying to detect residues or pheromones. One even theorized that humans must have released some unknown repellent agent, but no chemical traces were found. The Vorcral, when later tracked by drone, had fled into the lower atmospheric vents and disappeared entirely. The footage spread within 24 hours. Every species in the quadrant had seen the predator halt at the site. No, the scent of humans. Debate began instantly. Was it their strange immune systems? Was it the strange way they regulated trauma, or how they didn't succumb to pain the way other species did? I've seen them survive infections that should have liquefied them, a Valerie soldier admitted to his diplomat during a closed session. Maybe the Vorcral remembers. Another whispered, they don't surrender, they don't die quietly. It knew it couldn't win. No one could agree. But everyone agreed on one thing. The predator, the thing that had never hesitated, had turned away. Jacob didn't sleep. He tried twice, but the moment he closed his eyes, his mind conjured the shape of the Vorcral standing just beyond the reinforced door, breathing like a locomotive and staring in with something that shouldn't have existed in its DNA. Hesitation. The medical wing lights had been dimmed to a soft blue. Alan was unconscious now, heavily sedated, a pressure brace around his spine. The rest of the human staff, haggard and jittery, moved between cots and quiet conference rooms. Everyone was being monitored. Every 15 minutes, a nurse checked vitals. One translator, Sandra, had a resting heart rate near 130 for hours. They had to give her beta blockers. Jacob's own blood pressure hadn't dropped below 160 over 110 until early morning, despite the IV antihypertensives. His eyes were bloodshot, his hands were still shaking. But the peace talks were still scheduled for 18 hours later. The Villari didn't cancel. And that was unusual. The Villari Union had suffered too. 4 of their guards had been killed during the breach, but none of their losses occurred inside the human compound. That detail spread through unofficial channels before anyone could contain it. Jacob found himself summoned to a closed-door session with the lead Villari negotiator, High Diplomat Ralzina, earlier than planned. She was accompanied by 2 aides and 2 security officers who seemed far more curious than protective. He was escorted there slowly, walking stiffly. His lower back ached from when he'd thrown himself across a table to pull Sandra down during the alarm. He'd bruised his ribs in the process, confirmed by the medtechs. Nothing cracked, but it hurt to breathe too deeply. And no, they weren't giving him anything stronger than NSAIDs. Negotiators needed clear minds. He entered the chamber under dim bioluminescent lighting and bowed stiffly in respect. Ralzina opened without preamble. "We do not understand what we saw." Jacob sat, careful not to wince. Neither do we. Her translator clicked, then echoed in English. It should have killed you all. Well, Jacob said slowly. That was the expectation, yes. There was a long pause. The Vorcral does not retreat, one of her aides said. It doesn't possess the behavioral schema for strategic withdrawal. It has no social hierarchy, no deterrent response, no pheromone coding for fear. It simply kills until it starves or is destroyed. Then what changed? Jacob asked. He didn't expect an answer. Ralzina made a slow chime, something like thoughtfulness. We have monitored the human compound. Your people responded erratically. There were no organized weapon emplacements. One of your personnel tried to set off a fire suppression system manually. Another, she paused, threw a chair at the camera and shouted at it. Jacob closed his eyes. That would be Choi. This is not an insult, this is chaos, not defensive posture, not cohesion. And yet it ran. Ralzina remained silent for several seconds. Then, with deliberate calm, she asked, Is there something about your kind that the rest of us cannot sense? Jacob let that hang. He wanted to say, no, he wanted to say, we're just people. But that wasn't what history said. Humanity's arrival in galactic diplomacy had left trails of baffling stories, first contact expeditions that survived crash landings in methane swamps, disease outbreaks that mutated and killed the pathogens instead of the humans, prisoners of war who held their organs in place with belts until extraction crews arrived. And now, this. Jacob finally said, We don't die easy. Ralzina regarded him carefully. Then, quietly, that may be what the Vorcral sensed. 3 hours later, in the medical wing, Jacob sat while a technician carefully removed his monitoring leads. You're borderline stable, she told him. Don't overdo it today. Too late, he muttered. Across the wing, Sandra was awake now and eating crackers. Her pupils still hadn't fully normalized. One of the junior aides had torn a ligament in his wrist when trying to bar a side door. He was in a splint, typing one-handed. There was no glory here. No one was celebrating. But no one had died. The Velari, surprisingly, sent medical supplies unrequested. Human physicians were stunned at the quality. High-end analgesics, calibrated nutritional infusions, even heat pads designed to match human circulation. One package was labeled, in an oddly formal translation, for your wounded courage. Outside the rest compound, a soft perimeter was established non-threatening, just extra security drones. The Velari added more of their own, not facing the humans, but outward. Protective. Jacob stood on the central walkway with Choi later that evening, watching the sky shift from bright violet to shadowed indigo. They're afraid of us, Choi muttered. Jacob shook his head. Not afraid. They're recalculating. She glanced at him. Same thing. In the Velari internal archives, debates raged. Scientists and behavioral experts submitted early hypotheses. One argued that the Vorcral had an emergent heuristic, a near-instinctual decision-making process that could interpret prey risk dynamically. It wasn't fear. It was survival math. And for the first time, that math didn't add up. Another expert insisted it was chemical, that humans released cortisol, epinephrine, and other compounds during panic in such volatile quantities that it mimicked hostile territory. A third said, simply, it sensed something we do not possess. A refusal. In a sealed chamber elsewhere on the station, a pair of hidden figures watched the footage again. They belonged to the radical faction who had orchestrated the release of the Vorcral. This was impossible, one hissed, pacing. It was supposed to shatter the treaty. The humans were supposed to be reduced to bone. It didn't even try. It didn't even try. They had lost control of the narrative. Galactic media now labeled humans as the prey that fights back. One Velari official unofficially referred to them as a biological deterrent. Even neutral species had begun issuing revised first contact protocols involving humans. In the event of human presence, reclassify threat assessment tier. What was meant to be sabotage was becoming myth. The faction leader crushed a data slate with 3 fingers. We've made them more dangerous. Back in the human compound, Jacob finally allowed himself to eat something solid. Chicken broth and protein biscuits. A Vilari diplomat sent over a carefully wrapped box, containing something akin to fruit safe for human digestion, mildly sweet, and filled with electrolytes. The note attached simply read, "May your edges remain unbroken." He chewed in silence, sitting near the medical wing where Alan was still recovering. Choi passed by and nodded. "Pressure's dropping back to normal," she said. "Nurses seem relieved." "About me?" "About everyone." Jacob didn't respond, his ribs still ached. He'd need a few more days before full mobility returned. Sandra was scheduled for another cardiac checkup in 12 hours. The sprained wrists and dislocated shoulder in the team were minor injuries, yes, but real. The human body didn't bounce back overnight. And neither did the mind. They all needed time, rest, hydration, professional counseling. But they were still here. And the deadliest predator in the galaxy had walked away. The next negotiation session began exactly 31 hours after the incident. Jacob walked in slower than usual, stiff from the bruised ribs and lingering fatigue, but standing. The Velari delegation had doubled its personnel, not in defense, but observation. And though no one said it outright, every one of the Velari guards stood slightly off angle from the human side, as if unsure whether they were protecting them or monitoring them. Jacob noticed. So did everyone else. "Take note," he whispered to Alan, now in a light support brace and a pain patch. "We just became the most carefully watched species in the room." Alan smirked weakly. "About time." Jacob glanced at him. "Don't start with the jokes yet. My blood pressure can't handle it." The Vilari diplomat Ralzina entered after them, flanked by science envoys and a military attaché. That was new, and unnecessary, at least officially. But Jacob didn't object. He knew exactly what this was. This was the meeting after the world shifted, when nobody could admit what they saw but couldn't forget it either. There were no opening pleasantries. Ralzina began with an updated cooperation clause. Trade stipulations had shifted more flexibility for human contractors, less overhead for mixed-species vessels. Security protocols were being revised to include shared response units on Velari border colonies. Jacob read through the text quickly. He frowned. "You're fast-tracking defense integrations," he said quietly. Ralzina inclined her upper torso. "It is the logical progression. You weren't open to this last week." "Last week," she said. "We had not observed the Vorcral hesitate." A moment of silence passed, thick with mutual understanding. Jacob tapped the datapad softly. "You're aligning with us because we scare the thing that scares everyone else." Ralzina didn't blink. "Would you not do the same?" Jacob nodded once. They both understood diplomacy. Behind the closed doors, elsewhere on the station, galactic observers were beginning to talk. The Vorcral incident had leaked in more detail than anyone expected. Someone, probably several someones, had transferred raw footage to media brokers in the Hydari quadrant. News feeds now ran looped clips of the beast, halting mid-charge, of its hunched limbs twitching, of its eyes locking on the humans behind the reinforced glass, and retreating. It became the most replayed clip in broadcast history within 3 days. Expert panels debated for hours. They didn't move like prey, one zoologist argued. They braced. Not to run, to fight. Another responded, "But that's irrational. When you're faced with overwhelming power, self-preservation demands retreat." A third more quietly said, "Humans don't follow biological scripts." The term caught on. Scripts, as if other species followed programs, expected reactions. Predictable, sensible, and humans were not. In the Velari Diplomatic Center, the science team requested direct interviews with the humans involved. They phrased it politely, nothing mandatory, of course, but with a kind of scholarly urgency Jacob found oddly flattering and slightly disturbing. The first was with Sandra, the translator who'd experienced an acute stress reaction. She answered questions calmly now, well-rested and under supervision. "Did you believe you were going to die?" one of the Velari scientists asked. "Yes," she answered, completely. "Then why didn't you attempt escape?" Sandra paused. There was nowhere to go, and even if there had been, it wouldn't have helped. The scientist tilted his head. "So you accepted death?" She blinked. "No, I just didn't want to waste time on dying. The room fell silent. Another asked, "When you saw the Vorcral, what was your thought?" "I thought about the fire suppression system," she said. "It doesn't release oxygen foam in manual override. That could have blinded it, maybe bought us 10 seconds. The scientist looked confused. "You were calculating tactical resistance?" "I was calculating how to slow it down." "But not to escape?" "No," she said. "To give the others a chance to do something worse to it." That line also made the broadcasts. So did the footage of a human security officer, Choi, hurling an office chair toward the beast's shadow on the glass. "No other species does this," one commentator said. "They were outmatched, cornered, no real weapons, and yet they didn't run. They braced, they planned, they postured. One even tried to bait it by yelling through the wall." Another panelist added, "That is not predator-prey behavior, that is intra-predator confrontation." And suddenly, humanity wasn't just unpredictable. It was unsettling. Jacob reviewed the new diplomatic draft that night from his quarters, his ribs still sore and his legs aching from too much standing. The peace agreements were accelerating. Every section now had language tilted in humanity's favor, not by much, just small nudges. Easier logistics, higher trust coefficients in trade networks, broader scope for mutual defense. Subtle changes, but real. And none of it had come from leverage. It came from fear. He sat back, exhausted, and whispered, "What does it say about us, if our best diplomatic tool is being terrifying by accident?" A day later, the joint investigative team was assembled. Not military scientific, and multi-species. The Velari had authorized the most detailed behavioral review of the Vorcral ever attempted. They retrieved its biotrace from the landing zone, ran spectral analysis on every footprint, analyzed the angles of its departure. Nothing abnormal. But when they reconstructed its heart rate telemetry from scattered drone data, they found something impossible. A spike. Not a battle spike. Not predatory excitement. Something else. It read the environment, approached, then experienced an internal stress response, the lead analyst said. The beast biochemically became unsure. It was the first recorded instance of a Vorcral being unsure. The saboteur faction's plan, meant to bring blood and chaos, had triggered something else, a revelation. The galaxy's apex predator had not met prey. It had met uncertainty. One Velari journalist published an op-ed under the title, "The Prey That Doesn't Flee." It went viral in under 2 hours. In it, the journalist described the human response not as bravery, but stubbornness, reckless biology. An evolutionary anomaly that rejected fear when it should be paralyzed by it. They are not the strongest, they are not the fastest, they are not the oldest, but they are the one thing the Vorcral could not interpret, not because of what they did, but because of what they didn't do. Another publication responded with a chilling summary. If the predator is afraid of them, what else should we be reconsidering? Suddenly, military analysts across multiple species were re-examining old engagements with humans, their willingness to take casualties, to hold the line, to recover from injuries no other species would survive. Hospitals started publishing case studies. One Velari medical journal translated a paper on a human soldier who fought with a broken fibula and internal bleeding for 19 minutes before collapsing. The term death denial response entered formal classification logs. It didn't make humans look brave. It made them look wrong. In a private conversation, Ralzina addressed Jacob directly. "We have reason to believe your people are not seen by the Vorcral as prey." Jacob raised an eyebrow. "Then what are we?" She hesitated. "A rival." Jacob leaned back, exhaling. "That's not the reputation we wanted. But it is the one you have." 2 weeks after the incident, the station's hallways no longer echoed with tension. The guards still stood watch, drones still patrolled the perimeter, but the fear had shifted, reshaped into something more intricate than worry. Respect. Maybe even reverence. But not comfort. The peace accord between humans and the Velari Union was not only signed, it was expanded. What had once been an agreement of tentative cooperation had grown into a full interspecies compact. Shared research facilities, cultural exchange initiatives, emergency defense protocols. There was a clause buried in the final document about mutual environmental threat containment. Nobody said the word Vorcral aloud during the signing, but everyone thought it. The humans were the last to sign. Jacob's signature trembled slightly, not from nerves, but because his shoulder still hadn't fully recovered from the strain of hauling a bulkhead closed with Choi. The medics said the rotator cuff had been inflamed. Nothing torn, but it would be stiff for weeks. Still, he signed. And the galaxy shifted again. I still think this whole thing's insane, Choi muttered, sipping a thin broth at the recovery wing 2 days after the ceremony. We didn't win anything. We just didn't die. That's a win where I'm from, Alan said from his cot, flexing his back carefully. He'd finally stood upright without assistance the day before, still wearing his brace. Sandra chimed in without looking up from her tablet. There's a new theory going around in the xeno-behavioral circles. Someone thinks the Vorcral reacted to the sound of our stress. Jacob frowned. Meaning? Not just pheromones, not just movement. Our heart rates, breathing patterns, even micro-vocal tremors when we're panicking. They think it heard us panicking and didn't recognize the pattern. Like it didn't match anything it knew. Great, Choi snorted. We scared it by hyperventilating, Jacob said quietly. We didn't sound like prey. The investigation into the saboteurs finally reached its end. The radical faction behind the Vorcral release was exposed, though the names were kept sealed. Villari internal authorities quietly issued a statement acknowledging internal extremism and reaffirming the Union's commitment to peace. The humans didn't request reparations. They didn't have to. The political wind had shifted so dramatically that human colonies now received diplomatic overtures from species that had ignored or dismissed them months ago. Embassies opened, joint training exercises were scheduled. Even the Andrashi, once openly skeptical of human involvement in galactic politics, began exploratory talks. It wasn't fear of human firepower. It was fear of something else. The kind of fear that couldn't be quantified. The last traces of the Vorcral had vanished into deep orbital infrastructure. Tracking teams picked up its trail for only a day before it disappeared into the labyrinth of unregistered tunnels and vents woven into the station's old architecture. Some said it had gone dormant. Others claimed it fled the station entirely, burrowing into one of the asteroid tugs moored at the outer rim. No one knew. But no further attacks occurred. And it never came back. Jacob finally left the recovery wing on day 17, walking without assistance, though still with a slight limp. A physical therapist had ordered him to continue light movement and low-resistance stretches. The bruised ribs had healed, the shoulder was progressing, and his sleep had finally stabilized almost 6 hours straight. His body had bent but didn't break. It always amazed him. That ratio, the absurd strength of a body, constantly failing and healing at once. He stopped by the observation deck, on his way to the final debrief. The stars outside glinted like dust scattered across obsidian, and among them distant, cold and indifferent, waited the rest of the galaxy. He heard footsteps behind him. Ralzina. The Vehlari diplomat stood with a dignity that never wavered, her soft glowing eyes unreadable. We have completed our internal assessments, she said. Jacob didn't look away from the glass. And you were not the target of the beast, you were the variable. He finally turned. Is that supposed to be reassuring? It was not intended to be, she replied softly. It is simply the truth. They stood in silence for a moment. Ralzina's voice changed lower, more contemplative. When our historians look back, they will not remember the trade routes or tax concessions. They will remember this. The deadliest creature in known space reached your door and turned away. Jacob nodded slowly. That's not the kind of thing people forget. No, she agreed. It becomes legend. Back in the human compound, someone had printed a small sign and hung it above the reinforced security door. Beware of humans, not edible. Choi said she didn't do it. Everyone agreed that was a lie. Sandra started compiling first-hand accounts for publication, not as propaganda, just as preservation. She titled the file, "The Day the Predator Gave Up." Alan requested a transfer to Earth for full physical therapy. He said the artificial gravity here was throwing off his recovery timeline. the staff signed his brace in marker before he left. Jacob spent his last night on the station, sitting alone with a cup of lukewarm tea, watching footage from the breach one more time. He watched himself yell. He watched Choi barricade the corridor. He watched Sandra freeze, then dive. He watched the Vorcral stop. In that moment, caught in motionless digital clarity, he saw it again. That strange posture. Not attack, not curiosity. Doubt. He paused the footage. That was the legacy now. Not dominance, not victory. Just the realization that, for all their flaws, weaknesses, and unpredictable biology, humans refuse to die the way the universe expected them to. And sometimes, that refusal alone was enough to make a monster walk away. When Jacob's shuttle detached the next day, heading back toward Earth, he leaned back into the seat with a long exhale. The data packets were already on their way across the networks. Scientific journals would debate it for years. Military analysts would redraw threat maps. Cultural theorists would publish think pieces for decades. But none of them had been there. Not really. None of them had watched death arrive and flinch. He closed his eyes and muttered a quiet sentence that would later be misquoted across 6 species. We're not unbeatable, just too damn unpredictable to bother with. And the galaxy, shaken by the fear of the predator, would remember something even more unsettling. There was a species out there that wouldn't scream, or run, or surrender. A species that would stare death in the face, bleeding and shaking, and still mutter, "Not today."